This podcast contains adult content and discussions of first-time sexual experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Some stories may include themes that are sensitive or triggering for some audiences. Welcome to Sexual Encounters, the very first time, the podcast where we talk about first times for better, worse, and everything in between. I'm Mary Jane, and today we're exploring something that's not often taught clearly enough: consent during first sexual experiences. So many first times happen without clear communication or without a real understanding of what consent looks and feels like. In this episode, we'll unpack those challenges and offer tools for creating safer, more empowering experiences. You know, the topic of consent and first times is actually what inspired this podcast in the first place. It started while I was watching a Law and Order SVU episode. In this episode, a 16-year-old boy and a middle-aged woman meet at a hotel bar. Drinks flow, boundaries blur, and they end up having sex. A first-time sexual encounter for the teenage boy and a middle-aged woman who had no idea he was a teenager. Days later, the boy's mother presses charges for statutory rape, while the woman claims she was the victim, drugged and unable to consent. The jury can't decide who, if anyone, is guilty. That tangled storyline made me realize how complicated first sexual experiences can be, especially when age, power, or assumptions blur the lines of consent. It took me back to my first time and led me to wonder how many real first times may have felt just as confusing. Then I thought about the real-world story, the 2018 allegations of sexual misconduct against comedian Aziz Ansari. A woman, known publicly as Grace, wrote an article about how going on a date with Ansari left her feeling uncomfortable and pressured, describing actions that felt coercive and disregarded her nonverbal cues, even though no laws were broken. She says that she later texted Ansari to say she wasn't comfortable with what happened, and he apologized. Some people said it was just a bad date. Others saw it as a clear violation of consent, and one that exposed how much we misunderstand nonverbal cues, pressure, and emotional readiness. And that's what today's episode is about. How first sexual experiences aren't always clear-cut, even when no one says no, even when it technically looks consensual, it can still feel wrong. There are many myths about how first times are supposed to unfold, and often those myths leave no room for consent. From movie scenes where things just happen to ideas that talking about consent will kill the mood, the messages we absorb can make it harder to have a conversation we actually need. So let's take a moment and bust some common myths about consent and first times. Joining us today is Dr. Neil McArthur, Director of the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics. He teaches courses on sexual ethics, human rights, and the philosophy of law, and his work explores everything from Enlightenment political theory to emerging questions around technology and sexuality. Dr. McArthur is also known for coining the term digisexuality together with Dr. Maki, and has written widely on alternative sexual identities and LGBTQ plus rights. His work has appeared in outlets like Vice, The Guardian, Time, and Fast Company. We're so excited to have him here to help us unpack the legal and ethical sides of consent, especially when it comes to first-time sexual experiences. Dr. McArthur, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So let's get into the myths. One of the most common one is that if it feels right, you don't need to talk about it. There's this idea that chemistry or mutual attraction somehow makes a verbal conversation about consent unnecessary. How would you respond to that? And why is it so important to encourage clear communication, even when things feel naturally in sync?
Yeah, I think that, I think we need to be compassionate with people in understanding that it is often the case that it seems like things just happen naturally. And so I understand why people get that impression. We just aren't very good sometimes at realizing what other people are thinking. I think we think we're better at it than we actually are. So I think that, often mistakes can happen, or people can misunderstand each other, or people can misread signals. I think one of the most important things, for instance, is just that somebody may be very enthusiastic about a certain level of contact, but, that might not mean they want another kind of contact. And so I think the fact that someone is obviously wanting to be there and wanting to be with you doesn't mean that they want to do everything that you want to do. So I think that's one of the reasons why clear communication is really important, and to make sure that everyone has the same set of boundaries and the same set of sort of expectations.
And another common one is that talking about consent will ruin the mood. Some people worry that bringing up whether they want to do it or not will feel awkward or kill the spontaneity. From your perspective, why is this idea so persistent? And how can we reframe consent as something that actually enhances intimacy rather than disrupt it?
Well, I think it's a product mostly of the fact that we live in a society where we don't really like, I mean, as a society, we talk about sex a lot, but we don't necessarily have open and healthy conversations with, with people individually. We talk a lot about sex in the media and so on, but I don't think we have very good models for how to talk about this stuff. I think that it's really the lack of models that's one of the big problems. People just don't learn it and they don't see it. I mean, it's hard to think of movies, for instance, where this happens. Just about every movie, people just sort of suddenly throw off their clothes and jump into bed or whatever. I would be hard pressed to think of, a good model for good conversations about consent that aren't awkward and that are healthy. So I think that we have a long way to go in terms of education, in terms of the media. And so until we start actually teaching people how to do this, because I don't blame people for not knowing how to do this. You're not born knowing how to talk about sex. So if nobody teaches you and you don't see any examples of it, then of course you're not going to know how to do it. And so of course you're going to think of it in sometime, or at least some people are going to think of it in terms of, well, this is awkward. This is just going to spoil everything.
And then another common one is that if someone doesn't say no, it means yes. But consent is not always straightforward, and people sometimes feel unsure or they're hesitant or uncomfortable in expressing themselves in the moment. I mean, a public story that happened a few years ago with comedian Aziz Ansari that sparked important conversation around this was how easily misunderstandings can arise when there's a lack of clear communication, not necessarily force, but a disconnect between what is said and what is felt. How can you encourage a better understanding of consent as something that requires an active yes, so that silence, hesitation, or passive behavior aren't left open to interpretation?
Yeah, I think one of the useful ideas here is to think in terms of enthusiasm. People sometimes talk about enthusiastic consent. And I think that, making people understand that you want your partner not just to sort of go along with things, but to be actually wanting to be there and wanting to participate and actually having a good time. I think that if you, if you think of it less in terms of, I think one of the problems too is that I think, in our society we often think of, sex as something that men need to get from women. And so I think if you look at it more as something that both people should be engaged in enthusiastically, and that if you don't see enthusiasm from your partner, I mean, talk to them anyway. But if you don't have enthusiastic participation from your partner, that's a good sign that you need to check in and you need to have a conversation about where things are at. Maybe they're just anxious or nervous, or, there may be lots of reasons why they're seeming to be fully participating. But I think that is a really good reason why you need to have these conversations.
So, Dr. MacArthur, in your experience, why do so many first sexual experiences happen without the clear conversations about consent specifically? Even though people know that the idea of consent matters, it often seems lost in the moment. What's behind the disconnect? I mean, you talked about the non-existent examples in the media. So, what's your perspective?
Well, I think you start with the fact that, first of all, most people during their first encounter are pretty young. And, when we're young, we we aren't that good at a lot of things, and we haven't done a lot of things. We don't have experience, we don't have education, we don't have a fully developed frontal cortex. So, I think that we can be compassionate towards young people in feeling confused, overwhelmed, unsure how to do all this. I certainly don't blame young people for having misunderstandings, having lack of knowledge about these things. Because, I think people do need to seek out information and seek out how to do this, but it should also be up to us as a society, as parents, as teachers, to actually give kids the tools they need. Because if they're just going out and finding out on the internet, obviously that's a very unreliable source. And we know that a lot of young people learn, quote unquote, a lot from porn, which is not always good models at all. So, yeah, if we don't want them going to random internet Reddit threads or, watching porn, then we need to actually be willing to engage with them. And we need to actually have sex education in schools, and parents need to be able to talk about it. I mean, again, I don't think we need to blame parents, because I don't think parents get very good education about how to talk to their kids. So, I think it happens all the way along the food chain, as it were: schools, parents, society, media. So I think this is a society-wide problem, and I think that, I think we need society-wide solutions.
Indeed. I mean, I myself have a teenage boy, and I don't know how to talk to him about about sexual encounters, and even when I try to, he feels like it's awkward. So
Of
I
course, yeah.
understand.
Of course. I mean, I would feel the same way. I think if I remember, it was exactly how I felt when my parents tried to talk to me about this stuff. So, yeah, it is not easy, and certainly it's not something people can easily figure out on their own.
Indeed. A lot of these messages about sex, as you said, from the media and culture as well, they skip over consent completely. What would be your go-to advice to someone trying to navigate consent clearly and confidently, even if they've never seen it modeled before?
I think it's important not to be scared and not to be intimidated. I think my first piece of advice would be, this is okay. This is not going to, hopefully at least, if it's someone who, you want to be with, it's not going to, just having a conversation about consent is not going to lead them to not be interested in you anymore. I think that for people who feel awkward about this, I think it's important to recognize those feelings. You're not alone. The other person is feeling awkward as well. And so to know that it's okay to get these, it's okay to, not do this perfectly. I think that having these conversations, you don't have to feel like there's some magic formula that you have to use. You can figure it out with your partner together. If it's two people who want to be together, then hopefully the two of you can have a conversation and figure it out, and you don't have to say just exactly the right magic words for that person to know what you're talking about and to respond positively. And, I think the other thing is, if you're sensing that this person doesn't want to talk about it, or, doesn't want to, I think, that it might be a good sign that you can back off, right? I mean, I think that there's always another day. There's always other times when you can be intimate with someone. I don't think no sexual encounter is a do or die situation. So I think it's much better to be cautious and to, wait than to go forward in a situation where someone is uncomfortable or where, they don't give consent. I think it's always important to keep in mind that you can default to, backing off and waiting to a different time if someone isn't comfortable.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. McArthur. That was very insightful, and thank you for bringing clarity and care to a topic that's often confusing or overlooked, especially during first times. Your insights around consent are so important, and I'm really grateful that you got to share it with us.
Well, thank you so much.
Consent isn't just a checklist or a legal safeguard. It's an ongoing conversation that helps create safer, more connected experiences. If your first time didn't include clear communication about consent, you're not alone, and it's never too late to learn new ways of approaching intimacy. If you'd like to share your first time story or reflect on your experience with consent, we'd love to hear it. Submit anonymously at bit.ly/Let's Talk First, or you can DM us at Let's Talk First. And while we are talking about the importance of consent, there's another layer that shapes so many first sexual experiences: the legal side. What's allowed, what's not allowed, and what many people aren't even aware of when it comes to age of consent and first times. That's exactly what we'll explore next time on Sexual Encounters the Very First Time: the good, the bad, and the illegal. So stay tuned. You're listening to Sexual Encounters the Very First Time.